So Bournemouth have just sacked their manager Scott Parker in the wake of a 9-0 drubbing by Liverpool. Obviously this puts Bournemouth in a very tricky situation in the Premier League, but we're lucky enough to be joined by the Athletic's Peter Rutzler to tell us a little bit more. So Peter, why have Bournemouth sacked Scott Parker so early on this season?
Yeah, it seems as a bit of a shock, I think, from the outside to see a manager go so quickly into the new season, and particularly after some difficult games too, and ones where Bournemouth, have actually still got off the mark. But it points to a wider issues, and I think while it may seem a surprise to those outside of the club, I think those who follow the club and those around the club are probably less surprised that this has happened. It follows a summer where Scott Parker has been wanting and urging the club's board to invest in the squad, to make new additions, to strengthen. From what he saw as a squad that really needed to invest in a way that would help them bridge what is a very large gap between the second tier and the top flight. What's happened is that wish has just not been in alignment with the way the club's ownership and the club's hierarchy have wanted to run the club, to a point where we're now at the situation where Scott Parker has lost his job. Obviously it follows the 9-0 defeat at Anfield, which I think would be a normal starting point for someone coming at it from a blank slate. But the reality is that it's what came after that. The comments again about wanting to strengthen, comments also saying the team weren't strong enough, and all of that comes together really to leave a situation where Bournemouth have felt they need to act for the best interests of the club, both in the short and the long term. So a surprise from the outside, but there's certainly a lot that's been bubbling on behind the scenes.
I've got a quote here from the Bournemouth owner, Maxime Deman. He says, "In order for us to keep progressing as a team and as a club as a whole, it is unconditional that we are aligned in our strategy to run the club sustainably." Now, the important word there, I think, is sustainably. So is this all about money?
Partly to do with money. I think there's no doubt that Bournemouth have not invested the sums that some of the other clubs in the Premier League have done. Nottingham Forest is the obvious comparison point because of the way they've approached this window with nearly 20 signings, I think, and considerable outlays, and one of the highest in Europe. Bournemouth, I think, have spent around 25 million. I suppose you could look at Fulham and see what they've done. They've probably spent about double that. So on a basic level, Bournemouth haven't spent the money that probably Scott Parker would want them to, and that would have them compete in that way. However, I think for Bournemouth, they probably look at it from a perspective of needing to run the club carefully. The owner has pumped in a lot of money over a considerable amount of time. They're trying to build a new training ground, which they've restarted construction work on as well. And I think that they're just taking a more sustainable look at it, an approach that doesn't see them spend that kind of sums, which I think Parker feels probably might be needed.
We've seen approaches like this before in the Premier League. I think Norwich may be the most famous example of that. Does that mean that this puts Bournemouth in a lot of trouble in the league now? Is the expectation that anything that allows them to escape relegation, I suppose, is a bonus, but the reality is that this could be very much a relegation season for them now?
I think it was always going to be a challenge. I think once it became clear that they weren't going to spend those kind of sums, it was always going to be difficult. And maybe there was a realization there that they might need to think more longer term, perhaps with a kind of view to Norwich to say, look, if we don't survive this year, we'll try. But if we don't, then we want to be in as better position for the following year. The gap between the Premier League and the Championship does seem to grow, and financially it's enormous now. And for those clubs that don't feel they're in the right place to compete, you do have to spend a lot to get there. I think it depends how you see the Bournemouth squad, because I think from Parker's perspective, it was light in certain areas. They would want stronger additions in certain positions as well. However, there are a few players in there who do have a lot of Premier League experience. Jefferson Lerma, Philip Billing, Adam Smith, Lloyd Kelly, Dominic Solanke. There's a core of younger players there, and I think fundamentally for the club, you can't really have a situation where the manager's wanting to go in one direction and the club are looking at it from a different perspective as well. So it's a difficult one because the ownership and the club did invest in January to get Bournemouth into the Premier League with 5 deadline day signings, some of whom now you probably question and think, are they able to make that step up to compete in the Premier League? The likes of Siriki Dembele, who hasn't really been involved, Kiefer Moore, who's seen more involvement, but that's where there's sort of an alignment issue there, and I think that's where they've ultimately come down, and it's led to Parker losing his job.
Let's look to the future for Bournemouth. Do you think there are any managers available at this point in time who could keep this squad up this season?
I think fundamentally for Bournemouth, it needs to be with a clean slate, to have a positive atmosphere again. I think one of the things that has happened is there has been that sort of tension behind the scenes about what is going on, who's going to be recruited, and also coming in off the back of a 9-0 defeat like that, while also suggesting, the squad's not good enough. We may even have more of these kind of results. It becomes very difficult. So I think for any new manager, it would be a question of changing the atmosphere, trying to get the most out of the squad that they do have. And there are some young, talented players in there that, will want to show that they can compete and to punch above their weight on paper. So you look down the divisions, maybe someone like a Liam Manning, who's done very well at MK Dons, maybe even, a Nathan Jones, just depending on what kind of model that they would want to go Bournemouth. I've seen that Kjetil Knutsen at Bodo Glimt has been linked already, but it's difficult at the moment. It's still really early. It's difficult timing. Right before the end of the transfer window, there are lots of futures at play. Players who probably thought they may be on their way out are now probably thinking, what's happening here? Will I get another chance? Will there be a clean slate? Will they get the new manager in before the window shuts, or do they have to then do the window without a head coach? It's a tricky scenario, and the timing is not ideal at all. But I think fundamentally, it's whoever comes in is probably going to have to be realistic about their Premier League survival chances, and anything more than being competitive would be a bonus, I think.
Let's talk about Scott Parker quickly then. What's next for him? He's obviously developed this reputation as a manager who can get teams up from the Championship into the Premier League, but keeping them there seems to be a little bit harder at this point. So what's next for him?
Yeah, I mean, it's too. For Scott Parker, he's got 2 promotions on his CV, as you say, at the first time of asking as well, with Fulham and also with Bournemouth. He does carry a lot of respect within the game. I think for those who play under him and work with him, they see him as a motivational coach, a coach who can get the best out of players. But at the same time, this is now a second club where he's run into tension with the club's hierarchy. And I think for him, he'll probably want to have, at this point, be looking for a Premier League job, going into a job in the top flight and trying to stay there, of course. But whether that will now be the case, whether he'll now need to go for another sort of second tier job, remains to be seen. But it's not the ideal situation for him. It doesn't look great from the outside, particularly the way it has ended. But it's 2 sides. It depends how you see the dismissal, to be honest, because for some will say he hasn't been backed. He wanted a more competitive squad, and he's looking at it going, if I'm going to look after myself and give the club the best chance, I need stronger tools. From the other side, it's building up a tension, and it's just not the scenario you probably would want this late into a transfer window. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next, but I think he carries enough profile and respect for the job he has done at Fulham and Bournemouth that he will find work again, but it would just be a case of at what level that will be next.
Well, we'll be covering the Bournemouth story in greater detail as it unfolds over at The Athletic, so do head over there. But we'll also be covering news on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to this channel by pressing the button.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic brings you the best sports journalism in the world in a personalised experience, connecting you with the stories and teams that you care about the most. There's coverage of 13 sports, plus direct access to world-class journalists through live Q&As, discussions and podcasts. Not to mention, it's all ad-free. And you can try it now for free for 30 days by clicking the link in the description.